Reid's morning routine was a testament to his rigid determination.
6:30, the alarm's quiet chime, followed by the precise movements of making coffee, toast, and reviewing the day's tasks on his tablet. He worked at the research station, a low-slung concrete structure tucked away on the outskirts of the city, its purpose esoteric enough that most citizens rarely considered its existence. His days there were a meticulous procession of data analysis, cross-referencing meteorological patterns with seismic activity reports, a quiet, predictable rhythm he had cultivated for years. It was a life built on order, on verifiable facts, on the absence of anything that couldn't be measured or logged. This particular Tuesday began no differently. He logged into his terminal, the fluorescent hum of the main lab a familiar drone, and began sifting through satellite imagery for anomalies in the northern continental shelf. The air in the research station was cool, filtered, carrying the faint, sterile scent of ozone and cleanser. He preferred it that way. The outside world, with its unpredictable gusts and earthy smells, often felt too chaotic.
Around 10 o'clock, a knock came at the frosted glass of his office door. A colleague, usually a ghost in the quiet corridors, peered in. "There's an estate lawyer looking for you, Reid. Says it's urgent." Reid frowned. He had no estate. No living relatives he knew of, not closely anyway. The only family name he recognized was a branch so distant it might as well have been a different tree entirely. He rose, a knot forming low in his stomach. The meeting took place in one of the station's small, utilitarian conference rooms. The lawyer, a trim woman with a severe bun and a briefcase that looked as old as he was, introduced herself as Miss Albright. Her voice was crisp, formal. "Mr. Reid, I represent the estate of Eleanor Vance." The name was a faint echo, a whisper from a long-forgotten family tree. Eleanor Vance. Reid vaguely recalled his grandmother mentioning a great-aunt Eleanor who had vanished into the wilderness decades ago, a recluse nobody spoke of. "Miss Vance passed away 3 weeks ago," Miss Albright continued, her gaze unwavering. "She named you as the sole beneficiary of her estate. Specifically, him property." Reid felt a strange prickle on his skin. "Property? What property?" "A cabin," the lawyer stated, sliding a thick folder across the polished table. "Deep in the Blackwood Forest. Remote. Very remote. And a small sum of money for its upkeep, naturally. Blackwood Forest." The name itself carried a weight, a darkness. It was a place known more for its impenetrable density and old-growth timber than for any human habitation. A place where cell signals died and compasses sometimes spun erratically. I didn't even know he was still alive," Reid confessed, the quiet order of his morning shattering around him. Miss Albright offered a thin, unconvincing smile. He was a private individual. Her passing was, regrettably, sudden and without any obvious explanation. The local sheriff's department considered it a natural occurrence, given him age and isolation. Reid accepted the folder. Inside, among official documents and a map hand-drawn with surprising detail, was a single, faded photograph. It showed a small, squat cabin, almost swallowed by colossal, ancient pines. A shiver traced its way down his spine. It wasn't just old, it looked forgotten, a place where the sun struggled to reach. The following days were a blur of paperwork, explanations to his supervisors, and a growing sense of disquiet. He secured a week of leave, telling his colleagues he needed to settle family affairs.
The thought of the cabin, looming in his mind, pulled at him with an irresistible, unsettling force. He packed a minimal bag, sturdy boots, a compass, a basic first aid kit, and a satellite phone, just in case. The drive itself was long, hours spent watching the urban sprawl give way to rolling hills, then to denser, more menacing stands of trees.
The asphalt narrowed to gravel,
then to a barely discernible dirt track. The air changed subtly as he ventured deeper, losing the exhaust fumes and gaining the rich, damp scent of pine needles and decaying leaves. The sunlight, once bright and direct, became fractured, dappled, then finally muted by the colossal canopy overhead. He felt himself shrinking, an insignificant speck against the ancient, indifferent wilderness.
He checked the map again, a small red X marking his destination. The track became little more than two muddy ruts, overgrown with ferns and moss. He parked his vehicle where the path became impassable, the forest pressing in on all sides, a thick, green wall. The air was cool, even heavy, carrying a faint, earthy tang that was more than just soil and dampness, something else, something mineral, almost metallic, like old blood or forgotten iron. He grabbed his bag and began to walk, pushing through grasping branches. The woods here were different. Not just old, but ancient. Trees with trunks wider than his car rose like silent, watchful giants. The ground beneath his feet was soft with layers of leaf litter, but occasionally he'd feel the hard, unyielding presence of something else beneath, something root-like or stone-like. The map promised a clearing. He pushed on, his determination warring with a rising sense of unease. Then, through a final, dense curtain of foliage, he saw it. The cabin. It was exactly as in the photograph, only more imposing, more desolate. Gray, weathered timbers sagged under a moss-covered roof. The porch, warped and splintered, sagged precariously. Two small, square windows on the front stared out, devoid of glass in places, like empty sockets. A single, rusted chimney pipe leaned drunkenly. No smoke, no sign of recent life. Just an overwhelming stillness. The trees around it seemed to lean in, their branches like grasping fingers, as if guarding a secret, or perhaps holding something within. This wasn't just a cabin, it was a tomb. And he was standing on its threshold. It was the cabin. Squat and dark, just as the photograph depicted. Reid stared at the image, the faded paper crinkling slightly under his thumb. The windows, like vacant eyes, seemed to bore into him even through the photograph. A shiver, cold and sharp, traced its way down his spine. It was real. And now, it was his. The drive was long, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then to little more than twin ruts carved through the encroaching forest floor. The map, hand-drawn with an unnerving precision, guided him past landmarks that grew steadily more ancient and forgotten. He remembered passing a cluster of prefab structures, barely visible through the pines, marked simply as research station on the crumpled sheet, the last vestige of any organized human endeavor before the true wilderness began to swallow the land whole. The further he drove, the thicker the canopy became, sunlight fracturing into weak, diffuse rays that barely touched the forest floor. Finally, the track widened slightly, opening onto a small, overgrown clearing. And there it was. The cabin. It looked even older, even more swallowed by the surrounding colossal pines than the photograph suggested. He killed the engine, and the sudden quiet was profound, deafening. A thin film of dust coated the windshield, mirroring the neglect that seemed to cling to everything here. He stepped out,
the crisp forest air stinging his nostrils. The cabin stood before him, a sentinel of forgotten time. Something metallic and old, like forgotten blood or rusted iron. He spent the first few hours simply airing the place out, wrestling open stiff windows, and sweeping away the thick layers of grime. He started with the main living area, a single room dominated by a stone hearth. As dusk began to bleed purple into the sky, painting the windows in hues of bruised fruit, Reid lit the oil lamp he'd brought. He began to unpack, placing his few belongings on a rough-hewn table. That's when he heard it. A faint scraping sound, like claws dragging across wood, coming from the floorboards above. He paused, a shirt half unfolded in his hands. Just the house settling, he muttered aloud, his voice sounding thin and small in the cavernous space. Old wood expanding, contracting. He resumed unpacking, trying to convince himself. A moment later, a floorboard directly above his head gave a sharp, resonant crack. He flinched, his gaze darting upwards, half expecting to see a face peering down. Nothing. He shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. He was jumpy, that was all. The isolation, the strangeness of the place. He moved to the small, cramped kitchen, intending to make some coffee. He spun around, his heart giving a surprising lurch. The doorway was empty. The lamp cast a steady, unwavering light. A trick of the light, he decided, or perhaps his eyes, tired from the long drive, were playing tricks on him. He rubbed them, feeling the grit of exhaustion. He set his mug down on the counter beside a small, wooden carving he'd found tucked away in a dusty drawer, a crude, bird-like figure with sharp, angular lines. He'd meant to put it back, but it felt intriguing. He turned his back for a moment to retrieve the sugar, and when he turned back, the carving was gone. Reid frowned. He was certain he'd placed it right there. He scanned the counter, then the floor. He distinctly remembered setting it down. Perhaps he'd unconsciously moved it? He retraced his steps, checked the drawer again. Empty. He sighed, a frustration born more of confusion than annoyance. This place was already getting to him. He decided to explore the small bedroom off the main living area, hoping to find a more stable place for his things. He ran his hand along the wall, feeling for a light switch, but there was none. His fingers brushed against a loose section of paneling near the floor. Curiosity piqued, he pried at it gently. The wood gave way with a soft creak, revealing a shallow cavity within the wall. Inside, nestled in a layer of ancient dust, was a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn smooth, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. He pulled it out, a faint, earthy scent rising from its depths. It felt heavy, substantial, as if weighted with secrets. He carried it back to the living area, placing it carefully on the table under the lamp. He opened it, the spine groaning softly. The script inside was spidery, almost illegible in places, but undeniably old. The first few pages were mundane entries about weather and crop yields, but then the tone shifted. He saw a recurring symbol, a jagged spiral that seemed to draw the eye inward. The lineage must pay. Or it will take everything. Reid's breath hitched. The scraping sound from the floorboards above suddenly felt less like old wood and more like something moving. And the missing carving. He was not alone here. And the journal, clutched in his trembling hands, was just the beginning. Reid's breath hitched. The fleeting shadow in the doorway felt less like a trick of the light and more like an observer. And the missing carving. His gaze swept the room, the flickering lamplight stretching the shadows, making every static object seem to writhe. The small, wooden bird, intricately carved, was indeed gone from the mantelpiece. He'd placed it there himself, a small, comforting detail in the otherwise austere living room. Now, only an empty dust ring marked its absence. He stood frozen, listening. The scraping above stopped. The air in the room, already cool, dropped several degrees, raising gooseflesh on his arms. A faint, acrid scent, like damp earth mixed with something metallic, began to permeate the stale air. He waited, muscles coiled, for some explanation, some creak of the old house settling, some gust of wind rattling a loose pane. He forced himself to move, his boots loud on the pine floorboards. He ascended the narrow staircase, each step a deliberate, heavy weight. Dust motes danced in the pale moonlight filtering through a grimy window, illuminating nothing but empty space. No open windows, no disturbed furniture, no footprints in the accumulated dust of the unused rooms. The scraping sound, he told himself, had been a branch against the roof, or a mouse. The carving, misplaced. He repeated these rationalizations like a mantra, but the conviction behind each word was brittle, crumbling. Over the next few days, the cabin became a crucible for his sanity. The phenomena escalated, subtle at first, then undeniably overt. He'd leave a book on the small table by the armchair, only to find it on the floor, pages splayed, when he returned. A drawer he'd carefully closed would be left slightly ajar. He was meticulous, a man who valued order, and this slow, creeping chaos frayed his nerves. Then came the sounds. Not just the scraping, which returned with an unnerving regularity from various parts of the upper floor, but a low, guttural thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the cabin. It was a sound without a source, a deep resonance that settled in his bones, making his teeth ache. He could no longer rationalize. The house wasn't settling, it was shifting. The sounds weren't natural, they were intentional. He walked around the cabin in a daze, his gaze lingering on the ancient timber, the rough-hewn stones of the hearth, searching for an explanation. He felt watched, a constant prickle on the back of his neck, a sense of being observed by something ancient and patient. His determination to restore the cabin had curdled into a desperate need to understand its secrets. He needed answers, and the cabin was not forthcoming. He found the town's small public library, a squat brick building with a sign that read Local History and Research Station. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged paper and dust. The librarian, an elderly woman with spectacles perched on her nose, gave him a wary look when he explained his interest in the history of the old cabin and the land it stood upon. "That old place," she murmured, her voice raspy. "Been empty for years, most folk don't go near it." Reid spent hours poring over brittle microfiche, thumbing through heavy, leather-bound ledgers, and scanning digitized newspaper archives. He searched for his distant relative's name, for the cabin's address, for any mention of strange occurrences in the forgotten forest. The information was scarce, fragmented, like trying to piece together a shattered mirror. He found mentions of the land, dating back centuries, always described as unsuitable for cultivation or uncommonly barren. There were brief, almost dismissive articles about unexplained livestock disappearances in the late 1800s. A few vague reports of a local family that kept to themselves, known for their unusual customs and deep connection to the earth. No names were given.
The location was unmistakable. Then, a discovery. It was an ancient land grant, predating even the oldest structures in the area. It spoke of the land being held in perpetuity, not by a family or an individual, but for the appeasement of the earth's ancient hunger. There was a faded, crude symbol scrawled at the bottom, resembling a stylized, jagged maw. Appeasement. Hunger. The symbol on the deed felt familiar, though he couldn't place it. And he knew, too, that the cabin was not just a house built on an ancient burial ground, it was a sacrifice. The sterile hum of the fluorescent lights in the research station was a dull counterpoint to the growing thrum of frustration in Reid's skull. Hours had dissolved into a haze of yellowed microfiche screens and the dry rustle of ancient paper. He had combed through every digital archive, every local history file, every obituary for the region surrounding the forgotten forest. The information was scarce, as if the land itself actively resisted documentation. Nothing about the cabin's strange history, nothing about the unsettling rumors. Just silence, vast and deep as the forest itself. Reid pushed away from the terminal, the plastic chair groaning in protest. His eyes ached, gritty and raw. He ran a hand over his stubbled jaw, the weariness a heavy cloak. He felt a desperate urge to simply walk away, to leave the cabin and its growing malevolence behind, but the thought was immediately eclipsed by a cold certainty: he couldn't. Not yet. The cabin had a hold on him, a whisper in the periphery of his thoughts, demanding answers. He wandered through the labyrinthine stacks, the smell of dust and decaying lignin thick in the air. Shelves towered, packed with forgotten lives, unread histories. He paused by a section marked Private Collections, uncatalogued. A long shot, he knew, but what else was left? A young assistant, perched behind a desk piled high with binders, looked up, her expression a mix of boredom and mild annoyance. "Excuse me," Reid said, his voice rough. "I'm looking for anything related to the old Miller property, out past the old logging roads. Specifically, any personal effects or documents donated by the family." The assistant raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Most of the Miller collection is catalogued. What exactly are you hoping to find?" "Anything not catalogued," Reid admitted, a desperate edge to his tone. "Something overlooked. A diary, letters. Anything that might shed light on the cabin's early history." She sighed, a theatrical puff of air. "There's a small box in storage, marked Miscellaneous Miller Estate. It's mostly legal minutiae, old tax forms. But it's not officially processed." She gestured vaguely towards a narrow aisle. "Third shelf, in the back. Bring it to the reading room if you find anything relevant." Reid nodded his thanks, his heart giving a faint, hopeful thump. The box was indeed small, tucked behind a stack of crumbling almanacs, covered in a fine layer of gray dust. He retrieved it, the cardboard surprisingly light in his hands. Back in the hushed quiet of the reading room, he carefully lifted the lid. Inside, beneath a few brittle land deeds, lay a single, leather-bound journal. A thin, almost translucent sheet of tissue paper protected the first page, hinting at its age. The handwriting was tight, elegant, and faded brown ink. The first entries were innocuous enough: weather observations, notes on planting cycles, mundane details of rural life from a century and a half ago. The author, a woman named Ilara, detailed her initial excitement about settling on the land, about the promise of a new beginning.
Reid's fingers traced the elegant loops of his script, a strange sense of intimacy settling over him.
Then, the tone shifted. Then, more explicit. August 14, 1877. The forest breathes. I feel it, a slow, deliberate intake and exhale. It is not the wind. It is something deeper, older than the trees themselves. My husband dismisses my unease as the loneliness of the isolated life. He recognized the feeling Ilara described, the deep, unsettling resonance of the land. He turned the page, his breath catching. September 3, 1877. Not voices, not truly, but a pressure in the mind, a suggestion of hunger. It wants. It asks. It offers. My husband's crops have never been so abundant. The deer practically walk into our traps. But the price. The dreams are vivid, unsettling. Blood on the leaves. Ilara wrote of a pact, a bargain struck by the first settlers, a tithe to the earth. She spoke of a guardian, not of the forest, but of the entity, a lineage chosen to ensure the offering. October 21, 1878. It has been chosen. The youngest. So young, so innocent. The guardian assures us it is for the good of all, for the prosperity of the land. My heart aches. The blood must return to the soil. It is the only way to keep the hunger at bay. The land demands its due. It is tied to us, this place, through blood and promise. We are the keepers, the feeders, until the lineage ends, or until it consumes us all. Reid's hand trembled, the journal almost slipping from his grasp. The youngest. A lineage of sacrifice. The words echoed the premise, confirming his deepest fears. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was the land, or at least inextricably bound to it. And his distant relative, the one who died mysteriously, was part of this lineage. And now, so was Reid. The cabin wasn't merely haunted, it was a trap, a ritual ground, and he was the next offering. He looked up, his eyes scanning the quiet, sterile room, but all he could see was the vast, ancient hunger described in Ilara's frantic script, waiting patiently in the forgotten forest. The journal, brittle with age, threatened to crumble in Reid's trembling hand. The youngest. A lineage of sacrifice. The ink swam before his eyes, each letter a brand on his consciousness. The cabin wasn't just on the land, it was an extension of something ancient, something hungry, and he, Reid, was the designated meal. A cold dread, far more potent than the cabin's pervasive chill, settled deep in his bones. He stood, the journal clutched tight, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. Not the familiar creak of old timber settling, but a drawn-out, almost wet sigh, as if the house itself were exhaling. A whisper, dry as rustling leaves, seemed to brush past his ear, too indistinct to form words, yet too deliberate to be a mere draft. He spun, his gaze sweeping the dimly lit room. But the sensation of being watched, of being stalked within the confines of the cabin, was undeniable. A faint, acrid scent, like damp earth mixed with something metallic and rotten, began to permeate the room, making his stomach clench. He moved towards the window, intending to pull back the heavy curtain, to see the comforting, if indifferent, forest outside. His fingers brushed the thick fabric, and a sudden, sharp pain lanced through his hand, as if he'd grasped a shard of ice. He recoiled, his skin prickling, but there was no visible injury. Only the lingering,
phantom ache. This was no longer just atmosphere, it was an active assault. The entity was becoming overt, making its presence known in ways that twisted his very perception of reality. As he looked down, the pages flipped open on their own, not to the last entry, but to an earlier one, scrawled in a frantic hand, the station. They have records.
The old maps. It knows I seek them. The station?
Reid murmured, his voice hoarse. A memory surfaced, a fleeting conversation with his distant relative years ago, about some obscure local history and a small, privately funded research station on the outskirts of the nearest town. It was where the relative had supposedly spent time delving into regional lore, away from prying eyes.
Was that where the relative had learned of the pact? Of the lineage?
It wasn't mechanical, it felt organic, like a vast, unseen heart beating beneath the cabin. The walls seemed to breathe, the timber groaning with each pulse. He turned towards the door, his hand already reaching for the knob, when a guttural, wet gurgle echoed from the hallway.
It was too close, too real.
He froze, every muscle taut. The gurgle came again, closer still, followed by a sound like heavy, dragging cloth.
It was tall, impossibly so, and silent now, just standing there, watching him.
He wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his constricted throat. He backed away slowly, his eyes fixed on the encroaching form, until his back hit the wall.
You cannot leave.
The blood calls. It was his distant relative's voice, yet warped, stretched thin, imbued with a malice that curdled his blood. The sacrifice. Reid's gaze darted around the room, searching for another way out, for a weapon, for anything.
The window was his only option.
He pulled, but the sash was stuck fast, as if sealed by an unseen force. He yanked harder, grunting with effort, but it wouldn't budge. The wood seemed to twist and warp under his hands, resisting him. Behind him, the dragging sound resumed, slow and deliberate, growing louder. The cabin was a living trap, and he was caught. The entity didn't just want him, it needed him, needed his blood, his lineage. And it would ensure he couldn't leave to learn its secrets, to expose the pact, to break the chain. He was the youngest, and the sacrifice was, apparently, due. Reid's fingers, slick with cold sweat, scrabbled at the window latch. It was fused, rusted solid, a stubborn knot of metal that refused to yield. The shadowy form in the hallway pulsed, a deeper black against the dim light, filling the doorframe, a wall of pure dread. He hammered the heel of his hand against the latch, gritting his teeth, the pain a distant thrum against the roar in his ears.
The glass rattled, a fragile membrane separating him from the impenetrable forest, but the latch held fast.
Reid tore his gaze from the window, scanning the room.
A heavy brass candlestick sat on the mantelpiece, tarnished and solid.
He turned, gripping the candlestick like a bludgeon, his breath catching in his throat. "Get out," he rasped, his voice thin, reedy, utterly unconvincing even to himself. The brass object passed through it, meeting no resistance, only the stale air. Instead, it seemed to flow, like spilled ink, dissolving from the doorway, only to reform, impossibly, silently, in the corner of the room, closer to him. This wasn't something he could fight with brass. He stumbled backward, dropping the candlestick with a clatter that echoed too loudly. His eyes darted to the main door of the cabin, the one leading to the outside. It was his only other chance. He fumbled with the deadbolt, wrenched the door open, and burst out into the pre-dawn gloom. He didn't stop, didn't look back at the cabin, its windows like vacant eyes. He ran, blindly at first, then orienting himself towards the faint, overgrown path he remembered seeing on the old maps, the one that supposedly led to the old research station. He knew it was miles away, probably abandoned, but it was something, a sign of human presence, a desperate beacon in this encroaching wilderness. The forest immediately closed in, a dense, suffocating embrace. The path, barely discernible in the half-light, twisted and turned, each tree a gnarled sentinel. Was it real? Or was his mind already playing tricks? He couldn't tell. The forest seemed to lean in, branches like skeletal fingers reaching for him, snagging his clothes, tearing at his skin. He stumbled over roots that rose like coiled serpents from the earth, feeling a malicious intent in their sudden appearance. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only an hour, the trees thinned slightly, revealing a clearing. Hope surged through him, a brief, intoxicating rush. He sprinted the last few yards, his breath ragged. The front door, a heavy steel slab, was ajar, hanging precariously from one hinge. He pushed it open, stepping into a cavernous, dusty interior. Equipment lay strewn about, covered in a fine layer of grit and cobwebs. Desks were overturned, monitors smashed, wires dangling like severed veins. It looked like the place had been evacuated in a hurry, or ransacked. He moved deeper, his footsteps echoing. In a small, cramped office, papers were scattered everywhere. He knelt, sifting through the debris, his heart sinking with each empty, meaningless document. Then, beneath a broken keyboard, he found it, a thick, bound journal, its cover water-stained, its pages brittle. He opened it, his eyes scanning the faded, precise handwriting. It was a research log, dated decades ago. Most of it was scientific jargon he couldn't grasp, but then he saw it, a specific entry circled in red ink, unusual energy fluctuations originating from the old cabin property. Consistent, localized anomaly. Subject claims the presence reacts to attempts at egress. Appears to be a symbiotic relationship with the land itself. Old local folklore mentions a generational bind and a pact of sustenance. Further investigation required into the lineage of sacrifice spoken of in the elders' tales. Our instruments are failing, corrupted by proximity. We are unable to provide assistance to the latest claimant who arrived this morning, disoriented and terrified. He spoke of his family's inheritance. We are preparing to evacuate. The forest seems. Lineage of. Sacrifice. Pact of sustenance. Claimant. The words clouded his mind, confirming his worst fears, yet offering no escape, only a deeper, more terrifying understanding of his predicament. The journal ended abruptly, the last page torn, as if ripped away in a hurry. He looked around the desolate station, the shattered instruments, the silent evidence of a desperate retreat. He spun around, the journal clutched in his hand. Nothing. The forest hadn't just watched him. It had allowed him to reach this dead end, only to reveal the true nature of his entrapment. His efforts were futile. The cabin, the forest, the entity, they were all part of the same design, and he was caught in its intricate, inescapable web. His mind, already stretched taut, began to fray at the edges, the distinction between reality and hallucination blurring into an unbearable, terrifying haze. The journal ended abruptly, its final, chilling pronouncements echoing in the hollow space behind Reid's eyes, lineage of sacrifice. Pact of sustenance.
claimant.
He slumped against the cold stone of the hearth, the aged paper rustling in his trembling grip.
His mind, once so resistant to the supernatural, now wrestled with a grotesque understanding. The cabin wasn't just haunted, it was a trap, a nexus, a maw. And he, Reid, was the next offering. The air in the cabin had thickened, a palpable weight pressing against his chest. He felt observed, not just by the pervasive chill, but by an ancient, malevolent intelligence that now knew he knew. He couldn't just sit here and wait to be claimed. The journal, though incomplete, hinted at a larger narrative, a history deliberately obscured. He needed more.
A memory surfaced, a fragment from his brief, unsettling conversations with the estate executor. The executor had mentioned a small, abandoned facility deeper in the forest, a place the relative had used for private research in his later years.
A research station. The words had meant little then, dismissed as the eccentricities of a reclusive scholar.
Now, they screamed with a terrifying potential. If anyone had tried to understand this horror, it would be there. The faint path, barely more than a deer trail, wound deeper into the overgrown woods, the canopy overhead so dense that the afternoon light struggled to penetrate, casting the ground in perpetual twilight. In its center stood a low, squat building, its corrugated metal walls rusted to a deep ochre, windows either boarded over or shattered, gaping like empty eye sockets.
The entrance, a heavy steel door, hung ajar, one hinge torn from its frame.
He squeezed through the gap, stepping into a world suspended in time, coated in a thick, undisturbed layer of dust. The interior was a single, large room, partitioned by makeshift plywood walls. Fluorescent light fixtures dangled uselessly from the low ceiling, their bulbs long dead. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew, old paper, and something acrid, chemical. His breath plumed in the frigid air. He moved slowly, his footsteps muffled by the dust. Desks were overturned, chairs askew, as if a struggle had taken place or the occupants had fled in haste. Papers lay scattered everywhere, technical diagrams, geological maps of the region, faded photographs of ancient carvings.
One, thicker than the rest, caught his eye. Its label, handwritten in a familiar, spidery script, read, "The Claimant, Observations and Theory." His relative's hand. Reid pulled it down, the dust puffing into a cloud. He carried it to a less cluttered workbench, sweeping aside a broken microscope and a petri dish encrusted with forgotten growth. He opened the binder, his heart thrumming against his ribs. Diagrams illustrated strange, intricate patterns, resembling root systems or neural networks, overlaid on maps of the cabin's foundation and the surrounding forest. Beneath one diagram, a bold, confident hand had written, "Not a spirit. Not a phantom. A parasitic organism. Ancient. Terrestrial. A parasite? Not a ghost?" He read on, devouring pages. The relative had theorized the entity was a Precambrian life form, dormant for millennia, awakened by geological shifts or perhaps human intrusion. It didn't possess, it assimilated. It didn't haunt, it consumed. Its tendrils, unseen, burrowed into the very fabric of the land, into the water, into the bloodlines connected to the burial ground it claimed. The pact of sustenance wasn't a mystical agreement, it was a biological imperative. The entity required a constant, specific type of energy to maintain its existence, to keep its ancient, dormant form from fully awakening and spreading beyond its controlled territory.
That energy, the relative had concluded with horrifying certainty, was a particular resonance found only in human fear and life force, refined through a slow, agonizing process.
And the lineage of sacrifice?
It was a carefully cultivated bloodline, bred over generations, unknowingly tied to the entity through a primal, genetic imprint. Each generation, one member, usually the one closest to the land, the most sensitive, was chosen. Not to be killed outright, but to be slowly, meticulously drained. Their life, their sanity, their very essence, became the entity's sustenance.
A slow-burning lamp, feeding the ancient horror. Reid's breath hitched. He was the claimant. He was the lamp.
A final section of the binder, marked mitigation/defeat, offered no comfort, only a stark, horrifying truth.
The entity could not be killed. It was too ancient, too deeply entwined with the earth itself.
It could only be appeased, put back into a deeper slumber, and the cost?
A complete, voluntary surrender of a life. Not just any life, but the life of the designated claimant.
A willing sacrifice, not of blood, but of the entire being. To become a permanent, conscious energy source, a living anchor for the entity, allowing it to feed continuously, yet gently, without fully awakening, thus sparing others. The alternative was unthinkable. Refusal would unleash its full, ravenous hunger, consuming not just Reid, but the entire forest, and eventually, everything beyond. The cabin was merely its anchor, its primary feeding ground.
He understood. He understood everything. The entity's true nature was a primordial horror, a living, breathing parasite.
Its origins stretched into the mists of prehistory. Its demands were his very existence, his conscious, eternal sacrifice. And the defeat, the only way to save anyone else, was to willingly offer himself to the maw.
Reid's breath hitched, the stale air of the research station tasting like dust and forgotten secrets.
The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, sick buzz, casting a jaundiced glow on the stacks of weathered journals and half-eaten scientific reports. It wasn't a spirit, not a ghost tethered by unfinished business. It was something far older, an organism that didn't haunt but consumed, folding consciousness into its own, like a single cell engulfing another.
Assimilation.
The word resonated with a deep, primal fear.
The relative, in their frantic, elegant script, had detailed the entity's life cycle, its dormancy, and its awakening.
They had also, in a chilling addendum, outlined a desperate, theoretical countermeasure.
Not an exorcism, but a severing. A deliberate, ritualistic withdrawal of the connection that allowed the entity to manifest and feed.
The pact wasn't just an agreement, it was a conduit, a living umbilical cord stretching through generations, designed to nourish something that had no right to exist in their world. The relative believed the entity was drawn to the inherent biological and psychic energy of a specific bloodline, a twisted ancestral offering. To break it, Reid had to sever that cord, not with a knife, but with a conscious, absolute refusal, an act of self-sacrifice that would starve the thing into another millennia of sleep, or perhaps, dissolution. The air grew heavy, thick like wet wool.
The hum of the lights deepened, vibrating in his teeth. It knew. It had always known.
He moved with a grim purpose. Gathering the specific tools the relative had mentioned, a small, tarnished silver bowl, a handful of dried herbs that smelled faintly of loam and decay, and a piece of chalk he found in a dusty drawer. As he began to sketch the first symbol on the concrete floor, a low, guttural thrum started beneath his feet. It wasn't mechanical, It was organic, a vibration that resonated with something deep within his own bones. The chalk scraped, a thin, brittle sound in the escalating quiet. The symbols weren't arcane, they were almost biological in their complexity, resembling ancient cellular structures, interwoven and recursive. The temperature in the room plummeted, stealing the warmth from his hands, making his fingers stiff. A metallic tang, like old blood and rust, permeated the air, overwhelming the dust and paper scent. It was the collective consciousness of those assimilated, he realized with a sickening lurch, a cacophony of lost voices, all folded into the singular, vast hunger of the entity. They pleaded, they mocked, they promised oblivion. The second symbol took shape, then the third. A stack of papers on a nearby desk appeared to writhe, the edges blurring. The metallic tang intensified, tasting like copper on his tongue. It pulsed with a faint, sickly green luminescence. It was not a body, not a form he could comprehend, but a focal point of its presence, a swirling vortex of raw, consuming need. It pushed against his mind, a wave of pure despair, attempting to overwhelm his will, to assimilate his very intention. Reid felt his resolve waver, a sudden, debilitating exhaustion washing over him. His vision blurred, the symbols on the floor twisting into meaningless scrawls. This was its full power, not a physical attack, but an absolute psychological siege, an attempt to dissolve his identity before he could complete the ritual. He was a single, fragile thought against an ancient, hungry ocean. But then, a flicker of memory. The desperate scrawl of his relative, the warning about the pact, the sacrifices. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for every generation yet to come, to sever this monstrous lineage. He grit his teeth, forcing his trembling hand to continue. He reached for the silver bowl, pouring the dried herbs into it. The air around the shimmering entity thickened, coalescing into a more defined, though still abstract, shape, like a giant, chitinous insect trying to force itself into human dimensions, all sharp angles and impossible joints, constantly shifting. It emitted a low, grating sound, a sound of immense frustration and ancient fury. "I reject you!" Reid bellowed, his voice raw, hoarse, but resonating with an unexpected strength. "I sever the ties." He completed the final symbol, stepping into the center of the intricate design. The entity lunged, not physically, but with an immense, silent force that slammed into Reid's chest, stealing his breath. A flash of blinding insight hit him then, a horrifying reveal. The pact wasn't just for sustenance, it was a way for the entity to learn, to evolve, to gradually understand and replicate human consciousness, preparing for a true, physical manifestation. It was an intellectual parasite, not just an energetic one. His ancestors hadn't just fed it, they had educated it. He pushed back, screaming silently against the invasive force, holding on to the last vestiges of his own self. He raised the silver bowl, a simple act, but charged with generations of defiance. He threw the crushed herbs onto the symbols, a final, desperate act of ritual. Reid stood firm in the center of the broken light, his own existence a fragile barrier against an overwhelming tide, waiting for the consequence of his defiance. He clutched the final, tattered page, the words. The only recourse. A binding severing. One cannot truly escape the price. He remembered the sensation, a cold, crushing weight that had pressed down from the ceiling, through his skull, into the very marrow of his bones. It had been a soundless scream, a silent tearing at the fabric of his awareness, leaving him gasping on the grimy floor, the scent of ozone and something acrid, like burnt copper, stinging his nostrils.
Now, hours later, perhaps days, time had blurred into a smear of exhaustion and disorientation. He still felt it. A dull ache throbbed behind his eyes, a phantom pressure that suggested something vital had been wrenched free. The research station was quiet, eerily so. He pushed himself up, his limbs stiff, protesting with every movement. His fingers, still stained with ink from the ancient texts, trembled. He looked at them, then at the scattered pages around him. The confrontation hadn't been a physical battle in the traditional sense, it had been a war waged in the mind, a desperate struggle for dominion over his own perception, his very soul. He had held on, clenching the brittle paper, repeating the archaic incantation he'd found hidden within the ancestors' frantic scribblings. The words had felt like acid on his tongue, alien and dangerous, but they had worked. A shriek, not of sound but of pure psychic agony, had resonated through the room, rattling the very air. Then, an abrupt, terrifying cessation. Itself again. Empty. He pressed a hand to his temple, feeling the ghost of that crushing force. It wasn't just the exhaustion that made his thoughts feel like they were swimming through treacle. Something was missing. He tried to recall the face of a childhood friend, a specific memory from his adolescence, a beloved melody. They were there, just out of reach, like words on the tip of his tongue that refused to materialize. A chasm had opened in his mind, not vast, but insidious, swallowing fragments of his past. He knew he had lived those moments, knew they were his, but the vividness, the emotional resonance, had been leached away. A dull, flat echo remained. He stumbled towards a grimy window, pulling aside a heavy, dust-laden curtain. He wondered if the cabin felt different now. Or had it merely retreated, licking its wounds, waiting? A tremor ran through him, not of fear, but of profound weariness. He had survived. The entity, he believed, had been driven back, perhaps even weakened. The pact, at least for now, was severed. He was free, yes, but what kind of freedom was this, when parts of himself had been sacrificed to attain it? He looked like a stranger, his reflection in the grimy windowpane a gaunt, haunted visage. He felt a profound isolation, as if the struggle had not only scarred his mind but had also somehow thinned the veil between him and something vast and indifferent. The world felt subtly changed, muted, less vibrant. The colors seemed duller, the air thinner. Or perhaps, he thought, it was he who was changed, his perception irrevocably altered by the proximity to such ancient, hungry malevolence. He picked up a discarded map, tracing the winding, overgrown path to the cabin. The lines felt heavy, imbued with a new, unsettling significance. Not just to assess the damage, but to truly understand what remained. Was the horror truly gone, or had it merely burrowed deeper, leaving behind a poison wellspring that would forever taint the place, and perhaps, him? He looked at his hands again, at the faint, almost imperceptible shimmer that seemed to cling to his skin in the jaundiced light. He had paid a price, yes, but the connection, however tenuous, however subtle, had not been entirely broken. The entity was gone from the research station, but it had left its mark, and a piece of it, he suspected, now resided within him. A silent, watchful presence, waiting for the opportune moment to reassert its claim. The true cost, he realized, might only just be beginning to manifest. It wasn't a curse, not in the way the old stories whispered. It was a duty. The cabin wasn't built on an ancient burial ground, but as one. A vessel, a containment field. The entity, the malevolence that had twisted the very fabric of his reality,
wasn't a spirit seeking release or revenge. It was a constant, gnawing hunger, a primordial echo that had found an anchor point in the earth, and the lineage of his family had been the unwitting, then unwilling, custodians. The pact wasn't one of sacrifice to appease, but of stewardship to contain. Each successive generation, unknowingly at first, then with increasing clarity, had been tasked with tending the prison, ensuring its walls held, its energies remained dormant. His distant relative, the one who had drawn him into this nightmare, hadn't died mysteriously, he had simply failed. Or perhaps, more accurately, he had given up. A cold dread seeped into Reid's bones, colder than the air-conditioned chill of the station. He wasn't merely an inheritor of property, he was the inheritor of a vigil. The words on the page detailed the subtle rituals, the specific plantings around the cabin, the careful maintenance of certain stones, all designed to reinforce the psychic barriers. They spoke of the entity not as an intelligent, malevolent being, but as a force of entropy, a slow, insidious unraveling that fed on neglect and fear. It needed to be acknowledged, but never directly confronted, lest its attention be fully drawn. Reid lowered the page, his fingers numb. The paper rustled, a dry whisper in the unnatural quiet of the station. His gaze swept over the cluttered desk, over the half-filled coffee mug, the scattered notes of a forgotten lunch. The attempt had failed. The notes here were a testament to a mind slowly unspooling, trying to find a rational explanation for an irrational horror. He pushed back from the desk, the chair scraping loudly on the linoleum floor. The sound echoed, stark and intrusive. He needed to leave this place, leave this false sanctuary of reason. The truth wasn't in equations or chemical compositions, it was in the earth, in the ancient wood, in the bloodline that connected him to that desolate patch of forest. The drive back to the cabin felt endless. The landscape, once a blur of green and gray, now seemed imbued with a new, unsettling significance. The pact wasn't something you could break, it was something you either upheld or allowed to consume. And if it consumed him, what then? What would happen to the world beyond the cabin if its silent, entropic hunger was truly unleashed? The thought sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the setting sun. He pulled up the long, overgrown driveway. It didn't look menacing now, not exactly. It looked ancient, weary, and impossibly fragile. A prison disguised as a home. Reid cut the engine. He walked towards the front door, his footsteps crunching on dead leaves and pine needles. He reached the porch, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He didn't feel fear, not precisely. There was a profound exhaustion, a weariness that settled deep in his bones, but also a strange, quiet resolve. This was his now. This endless vigil. Inside, the cabin was still. He walked through the familiar rooms, touching the rough-hewn walls, the cold stone of the fireplace. The entity wasn't gone. He knew that with an absolute certainty. It was merely dormant, its hunger temporarily sated, or perhaps simply waiting for him to fail, as his relative had. He ran his hand along the aged wood of a window frame, feeling the faint vibrations of the house, the subtle hum of the earth beneath it. He was no longer just Reid, he was the latest guardian, the reluctant keeper of a forgotten horror. He opened the front door again, stepping out onto the porch. He scanned the tree-line, the dense, impenetrable wall of the forest. It would be a solitary existence, marked by the constant awareness of the ancient hunger coiled beneath his feet. He closed the door, the click echoing in the vast quiet.
The cabin settled around him, a silent sentinel. Reid stood in the dim light filtering through the small panes, listening. He heard the wind sighing through the eaves, the creak of old timbers, and beneath it all, barely perceptible, the faint, almost imperceptible thrum. It was a promise, a warning, and a life sentence. The horror hadn't been vanquished, it had merely found a new keeper.